Pride is my best attempt to hide my weaknesses and deficiencies in plain sight. And I think you can't see my issues, but I'm hiding them in plain sight. Because everyone can see that I'm wrong. Everyone can see that I'm out of line. Everyone can see that I'm being all of these things but me. This is Caesar Walker, the cool, calm, collected one.
And I'm Ronnie Gatry, the emotional one.
And we are the Tipping Point Podcast, your source for the black male's perspective.
Tipping Point Podcast.
I'm hiding the issues because that's really what it is. I don't want you to see this weakness. I don't want you to see this flaw. I don't want you to see this whatever's going on with me. And if I don't acknowledge it, then clearly you can't see it if I don't acknowledge it, right? But that's me hiding it in plain sight. And I think one of the reasons why this is something to talk about in leadership is because if I can't trust you to acknowledge that you're taking down the wrong satellite, even though the picture is clearly gone, how can I trust you for bigger things? If I can't acknowledge to my wife, I said this wrong. I raised my voice. I'm sorry. If I can't do that, if I can't acknowledge that I offended her, how can she trust me to do the right thing in the bigger things? Because we can all think about that one boss, that one person who refuse to own up to their BS, but everybody sees it. That's all we're talking about at lunch. That's all we're talking about in the break room, right? We can see it in plain sight, but for whatever reason, they've convinced themselves that if I don't acknowledge it, no, it doesn't happen. It doesn't exist. And you ruin your influence with people when you fail to acknowledge these things. In fact, it's my belief that when you do acknowledge those things, you actually build trust in people. Because leadership isn't perfectionism. It has a lot to do with integrity. It has a lot to do with doing the right thing when you're confronted with the opportunity to do the right thing. Doesn't mean that you do everything right, but when you realized, I ain't do that right. I ain't say that right. I apologize. My bad. People know, you know what? That took a lot out of you to say that. It took a lot out of you to acknowledge that. I really can trust you because that means you're going to do what's tough. You're going to do the tough things. Even though it's tough, you're going to do what's right. And I think for most, and granted, people got all types of issues, but what I'm saying, the reasonable human being understands that's the type of leader that I'm willing to follow. I'm not expecting you to do and say everything right, but I am expecting you in the face, being confronted with what you've done, to own up to it.
It's so funny you mentioned this. We had an event at work a few weeks ago, and I had the honor and privilege of sharing on a topic that my boss called leading from within. And to me, with what I shared in that meeting, it had a lot to do with vulnerability. I've said on this podcast before, I'm a firm believer that there's power in it. But I was very open about a lot of my struggles during 2020 and some years before that. And I shared a lot of thoughts and a lot of, a lot of situations that happened. And I linked them all to what was in here. And, confronting the lies I was telling myself. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Taking those lies, shaping them to develop a narrative against other people. All based off lies I'm telling myself. Yeah. So when I think of pride, I think vulnerability's on the other side of that. for sure. But also with pride, there has to be an effective to reduce your level of pride. There has to be an effective mechanism of leading from within, because you got to take on that pride head on.
For sure.
Like how does 26 through 30-year-old Ronnie tell himself that you got a lot of stuff wrong? That's a hard ask.
Yeah.
I've been trying not to use the term as much, but we're going into it. Thinking about my therapy journey, Walker, what people don't realize is this has been an almost 10-year thing for me. This has been going for almost a decade. And as I call this season that I'm in, you know, from like late 38 to current, that's how long it took me to really say, Ronnie, you've got to let go, and you've got to start acting on a lot of this help that you're spending a lot of time receiving, a lot of money receiving. At some point, you've got to convince yourself that this is helpful, and you're going to start exercising these things.